Easy English reading. The childhood of a miner's boy. The name of a coal mine where father worked was Monkey Nest. No one knew who first called it that, but someone had given it the name and it stuck. My brother Dan went to work in the mine when he was only 12 years old. There were 9 children at home, and Dad could not feed us all. It was against the law for a boy to work in the mine alone. He could only work with his father. But it is bad for a little boy to work in a mine, even with his father. My brother Dan got terribly tired working in the mine. He was so tired that he never said a word. He would not play with me in the evening. He would lie on his back in the yard and look at the stars. Father did not like to take his boys to the mine. He wanted to give us an education, so he sent us to school. But very often we had no shoes and no clothes. So we had to stay at home for a week, a month, or maybe even 2 months. One morning my father said to me, "Come here, son. You are going back to school. Your life is just beginning. You must study hard and then you will be happier than we were." There were many farms near our mine. The rich farmers' sons were the natural enemies of the miners' boys, and we often beat them. Ben Haskin was the richest farmer. He always looked at us with contempt. Of course, we did not like him. Bonnie Fern was his little girl. She was Ben's only child. I did not like her because she had everything and my sister Madge had nothing. Bonnie Fern had good clothes, and she wore nice shoes and stockings all year long. And Madge had to stay home when it was cold because she had no shoes. One day I was lying under a tree near Ben's farm. Ben and his daughter were working somewhere nearby. Suddenly I heard Bonnie's voice. "I hate those dirty miners and their children." I got angry and took a lump of dry earth and threw it at Bonnie Fern. It hit her on the cheek and she started to cry. I ran away. I was very scared. The next time I saw Bonnie Fern, she was alone, and I noticed how beautiful she was. Her hair was a beautiful black color, her hands were clean, and she never put her fingers up her nose like my sister did. I found a very beautiful flower and came back to the place where she was playing. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm Larry Donovan," I answered. "I live in the miners' camp. I brought you a beautiful flower. It is very hard to find such beautiful flowers here." "You're a dirty miner's boy," she said. "I don't want to play with you. Go and wash your face." Her father heard her voice and came to her. I ran away and hid in the woods for a long time. Another day I was standing near the pit head with my sister Madge and my brother Tim. We were waiting for Father. Suddenly I saw the mine owner, Mr. Stackpool. He was coming to the mine with his wife and his little son, who was 8 years old. The boy saw Madge, came up to her, and suddenly pushed her down into the mud, crying, "You dirty miner's girl! What a dirty face you have!" His mother took him by the hand and said, "Oh, Elvin, it is bad to do such things. Tell that little girl you are sorry. Tell her you are sorry, like a little gentleman." Madge began to cry bitterly. Then Tim came up to the boy with his hands full of mud and plop, he threw it in the boy's face. We all ran away crying. "Now go home and wash your dirty face." The boy ran home crying. We felt we had won the battle. Mother was cooking when a young miner came to tell her about Dan. He was afraid to tell her the truth and only said that an accident had happened. "Tell me, is it Dan?" she cried. Miners' wives and mothers feel bad news instinctively. "Why, Mrs. Donovan, no! You see, then it is Dan. It must be Dan." She sank down onto a chair, her eyes dry and shining. She never knew the relief of tears. 4 miners carried Dan on a stretcher and put him on his bed. Mother knelt beside him and held his hand. He was breathing heavily, and blood was running from his mouth. "Where does it hurt you, Danny?" Mother asked, stroking his face. He could not speak. and in the night he died. Tim took his place in the mine. He was just 12 years old. Father was terribly sad. He knew how bad it was for boys to work in an American mine, and Mr. Stackpool's mine was one of the worst. No ventilation, bad air, no safety measures. Many times he wanted to take Tim out of the mine, but he could not. We had so little money, but he did not take me to the mine. "Are you studying hard at school?" he often asked me, holding my face between his hands. His face looked so old and tired that I was ashamed I had not studied better. "Yes, Father, I am," I answered. We seldom talked at dinner. We ate seriously and quickly. But we stopped at once when Father said to us one day, "We're going to have a strike on the 1st of the month." The first days of the strike were joyful and exciting. There were enthusiastic meetings, brave decisions, but soon we saw wagonettes with scabs. Around them were detectives with rifles. Every morning and evening the miners came to the road where these wagonettes were coming. "Scab, scab, scab," shouted the men. "Scab, scab, scab," shouted the women. "Scab, scab, scab," shouted the children. The wagonettes passed by, and the scabs did not look at us. But even under the thick black coal dust, we could see how red their faces were. The strike continued. One day Mr. Stackpool, the mine owner, sent a letter to Father. He said he wanted to see him at his office in town. I went with Father. We took a sack with us because Father wanted to get some provisions on the way back. We had no money, but Father thought the shopkeeper might give us the groceries on credit. When we got to Mr. Stackpool's office, he said, "Oh, Donovan, I am glad to see you. I hope you workers understand now that the mine can run without you. Just the same. The pay cut must remain, of course. But I will bring back all the old men. You, for example, can be a very good pit boss. Here is a contract for you. You have a fine boy, Donovan." "Yes, he is a fine boy," said Father, "but he is tired. He has walked too far for nothing. We must get some provisions and be home by dark." There was nothing terrible in Father's words, but Mr. Stackpool became very angry. We walked away as fast as we could. We went straight to the shop. Fells, the shopkeeper, who had known our family for a long time, said he was sorry, but he could give us nothing more without money. So we went home with an empty bag. We went to bed right away. We knew that was the best thing to do when your stomach is empty. But late in the evening, the storm began. There was a terrible wind and very heavy rain. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Father opened it and a man dressed in black entered the room. Water was dripping from his clothes. He was shivering with cold. Father looked at him. "Who are you?" he said to the man. "I work at the Monkey Nest mine," the man said. "After work I fell asleep in the mine. The other workers must have forgotten about me and left. I found the shaft and came up. Now I am going to town, but I do not know the way." Before he could finish, Father punched him in the face with all his strength. He fell down. For a minute he lay with his feet in the room and his body outside. Then he got up and ran away. "You scab! You damn scab!" my father shouted. Then he took Tim and me by the arm and cried, "Boys! Boys! Listen to me. If you must be one, be a thief, a murderer, anything, but never be a scab. Do you hear me? Never be a scab." My father was not an unkind man. On a night like this, even a dog could find a place by his fire, but not a scab. It was hard to live in those days. We got our meat from a German butcher named Koch. I often went to town to get provisions from him. But at the end of the strike, our unpaid bill became so large that I was afraid to go to the butcher, and I did not know what to ask for. Everything was too expensive. "What do you want?" he always asked me when I came to him. One day I said, "I want a 5-cent soup bone." Coke gave me a blue bone but said, "Tell your father to come see me on Saturday night." Father looked worried when I came and told him what Coke had said. "It's hard to pay bills during a strike," he said. Another night, Fred Dodson, the owner of the house where we lived, came and asked for the rent. Father promised to pay him in a few days. Fred left, but Dad sat in his room for a long time, thinking and writing down figures. Finally, the strike was over. Looking back on those days now, it is hard to say exactly how it ended. Perhaps the miners lost the strike, but they certainly won the general battle. In a short time, Monkey Nest Mine was up and running again, and every day, as before, Madge and I waited for Father at the pit head. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard Father and Mother talking in the kitchen. "I want to send Larry to a good school," Father said, "but we have to pay for it, and we have no money. I will start shot firing. I will go to work at noon and do my usual work until 4, and then in the evening I will start shot firing. I will get an extra $4 every day. We will pay our debts and have enough to send Larry to a good school. It is all I can do, and I must do it." Mother protested again a shot firing job. No one worked long at it. It was a dangerous job in the American mines. The owners did nothing to protect the workers, but Father insisted. Of course, he promised to be very careful. His partner, Mike Riordan, was an old miner with one leg. The other workers did not like Mike, but we children often went to see him in the evening when he came home. He would often sing the sentimental ballad that all the miners knew and tell us many interesting stories about his life. Father worked very hard. He soon paid all our bills. Then one day he smiled and said, "You'll soon be going to a good school in town, Larry." He got up every morning at 6 and worked in the garden until 12. He liked his garden very much. Then he went to the mine at noon and did the usual work until 4. After that, he fired the shots. Father and Mike would run from room to room in the mine, putting their lamps on the fuses. They stopped at each fuse for a moment until the end began to burn. When they were sure it was lit, they shouted, "Fire in the hole!" and ran on. In a good mine, this work was not so dangerous, but in our mine, it was a question of accident every minute. At the end of the work, they came up through the air shaft. Above the air shaft, there was a kind of small house with a door. Every evening, we would stand in front of the door and wait for Father. One night, we waited at the air shaft for a long time, but no one came up. We heard a few shots, and then nothing. Then suddenly, the whistle at the pit head began to blow. We knew something was wrong and ran to the shaft. At the pit head, we saw a group of men and women. Mike was lying on the stretcher, his face covered with blood. Mother was standing next to him. She did not say a word. She was afraid to ask questions. Soon 4 miners brought another stretcher with Father on it. Then 6 or 7 miners' wives surrounded Mother and took her home. Mother walked quietly. She had the stoicism of all the miners' wives. A group of miners had found Father under a huge lump of coal, but he was still alive. There was a terrible wound where his eye should have been, and both his legs were broken. All the next day, long processions of visitors came to our house. Mother lay in bed and spoke to no one. Madge and I did what was necessary around the house. I wanted to go to Father's room and tell him that I knew he had done this dangerous work because he wanted to send me to school. But the nurse said I could not come in. All I could hear through the door was his heavy breathing. On the 4th day after the accident, my father died. Our house became very quiet after Father's death. I was afraid of the silence. I often woke up in the middle of the night. I was afraid of the dark. Mother said, "You must not be afraid of the dark." But I slept very badly. A year passed. There was another strike at the coal mine. One night we heard someone knocking at the door. Mother opened the door. A huge black man stood in front of us. He had a big wound on his cheek, and one of his eyes was closed. "Help me! Help me! Help me, missus!" Then he told us that some white men had beaten him. They almost killed him and threw him on a coal car. Then he had run away. He had asked some farmers for water, but they had just set their dogs on him. He was from Alabama. "Why did the white men beat you?" my mother asked. "I'm a striker," the black man said, "and I told the workers that we had to fight the scraps, and some men from the Ku Klux Klan were nearby and heard me." We did what we could for him. The next day he left. The scabs and their guards lived in tents near the pit head. They ate and slept there. One day the superintendent came to see Mother. "Will you cook for the men?" he said, "and let them eat in your house? I know you are very poor," he added, "and I want to help you." But Mother said, "Get someone else to feed your scabs." A day later, Fred Dodson, the owner of the house, came to the river where Mother was washing clothes and said, "The superintendent told me he asked you to cook for some of the miners." "Yes, he did, but I refused. He says this house is the only good building around here where he can feed the men. He offered me double the rent for it," Dodson said. "Then I can leave your house," said Mother. "No," said Dodson, "I do not want to, but I am a poor man, and I think the offer is very good." When Dodson left, Mother said, "We must find another house." I was about 13 at the time, and I decided to help my mother. A friend told me I could get a job in a railroad shop in town. The next day, I went to the station. I asked for the shop superintendent. "Do you need workers?" I asked him. "No," he said. "We are not taking any men, and of course we will not take a little boy like you." I was very sorry, but what could I do? I went home. On my way home, I met one of the scabs who worked at Monkey Nest. "Why do you work here?" I said to him. "Don't you know you are doing other people's work? You are just as much a worker as—" "What business is that of yours?" he shouted. "You just go your way." When I got home, I told my mother what the superintendent had told me. The next day, one of the miners who knew the superintendent of the railroad shop promised to help me. The next morning, Mother and I went to his office. "Are you strong enough to do hard work like a man, boy?" he asked me. "Yes, sir, I am," I answered. "That's good," he said. "I'll give you a job here." And from that day, I started to work in the railway shops. And that was the beginning of my life as a worker. As you can see, I started when I was 13 years old. I was 20 years old. Many years had passed. I had worked in many different jobs. I had seen many different bosses. And now I knew what I had to do. I understood why my father had died so young. I understood why my mother had aged before her time. I understood the whole truth about the strikes and the life we had led in the Monkey Nest. And one spring evening I was talking to Hans, good old Hans, one of the veterans of the labor movement in the United States. "I'll go with you, Hans," I said. "And what about your mother?" he said. "I'll give her all the money I have." "Look here, Larry," he continued. "Do you feel this lump on my head?" He took my hand and put it on his head. I felt a lump on it the size of a hen's egg. "A police baton did that. Can you stand it? I'm going." "Look at this." He opened his mouth. I saw that most of his teeth were gone. "I had nice teeth," he said. "The police didn't do this. The scabs did it. I still want to go. Your black hair will turn gray and then it will fall out. And you don't know the prisons. You don't know how hot it is in the summer and how cold it is in the winter. I'm going with you. You can tell me what you want. I am going."